Tonight, we'll be taking a slow, quiet journey into the world of Victorian courtship, a place where romance was less about passion and more about patience. Through endless parlor visits, chaperone strolls, and the soft rustle of calling. Cards, we'll explore why dating in Victorian England was such an awkward, tedious affair. So, settle in, breathe slowly, and let the soft rituals of history lull you into a peaceful sleep. It always began with a glance that meant everything. And nothing at all. In the grand chandelier-lit ballrooms of Victorian England, where the air was thick with the mingling perfumes of orange blossom and lavender. Romance was a careful, suffocating ritual. The idea of spontaneity, of catching someone's eye and simply walking over to say hello, was not just discouraged. It was unthinkable. Every glance, every step, every breath was guided by invisible strings of etiquette knotted by generations past. The ballroom itself was a curious paradox. A place designed for movement, yet drowning in stillness. You could hear it if you listened, the faint rustle of silk gowns shifting ever so slightly as young women stood, waiting, perched like porcelain figurines along the edges of the room, their gloved hands folded demurely, fans resting delicately. On their laps, eyes downcast but always watching. Somewhere, in the polished hush of the dance floor, the tap of patent leather shoes echoed softly. Gentlemen, clad in stiff evening coats with impossibly high collars, stood in clusters murmuring about politics or cricket, as though the evening were not, in fact, a fragile dance of social maneuvering. Above it all, the chandeliers loomed, their countless crystal droplets shimmering in the gaslight, scattering a soft glow across the gilded cornices. The air was warm, too warm, perfumed and heavy, pressing down on every breath, slowing every thought to a languid drift, and yet, beneath the slow, suffocating grace of it all, tension simmered. Because in this world, a simple glance could begin a courtship, or end it. Imagine a young lady, perhaps Miss Eleanor Fairchild, aged 18, fresh from finishing school. She's wearing a gown of pale blue satin with tiny pearl buttons that trail delicately down her back. Her hair, meticulously arranged in soft ringlets, is pinned with a single white camellia, a quiet nod to her family's modest aspirations. Eleanor stands near a potted palm, pretending to admire the orchestra, but really, she's listening for the faintest shift in the room's rhythm. The soft shuffling of chairs, the murmurs of introductions, the name that might be whispered in her direction, but she cannot look up too eagerly. Oh no, a lady's interest must be subtle, almost imperceptible, a glance that lingers for a heartbeat longer than is strictly proper. That is the invitation. Across the room, perhaps, stands Mr. Jonathan Pritchard, 21, recently of Cambridge, feeling distinctly uncomfortable in his new evening gloves. He, too, is glancing, but carefully, strategically, because in this suffocating game of glances, to notice too soon is forward. To notice too late is social oblivion. The distance between them is less than 20 paces. Yet it might as well be an ocean. Now. Consider the chaperones, hovering at the edges of this delicate tension. Mothers, aunts, and older sisters sit in rigid rows along the walls, like sentinels draped in lace shawls. Their eyes, sharp, practiced, miss nothing. A glance exchanged. Across the floor is never truly private. Every flicker of interest, every fleeting smile, passes through the silent scrutiny of a dozen watchful matrons. One might adjust her spectacles and lean slightly forward, feigning interest in a passing waiter, but she's noting, evaluating. Another may whisper behind a folded fan, a quiet rustle of silk. A coded message passed from guardian to guardian. No conversation, no movement is ever free from observation. And so, the glance lingers. It stretches across the polished floors, woven into the strains of a quadrille played softly by the orchestra. It rests on the delicate shimmer of chandelier light, nestles into the folds of damask curtains, and vanishes into the gentle sigh of a girl adjusting her gloves. Yet again, time in these moments slows to a meandering crawl. You can hear the Subtle sounds of it, the soft brushing of skirts as a young woman shifts her weight from one slippered foot to the other. The faint clink of a spoon against porcelain as tea is poured. The rhythmic ticking of a mantel clock, marking each second. With stubborn persistence, this is how Victorian romance begins. Not with declarations of affection or daring flirtations, but with a glance. The kind that speaks volumes yet says almost nothing at all, but for that glance to become more, to blossom into even the smallest of conversations, a labyrinth of etiquette had to be navigated that a gentleman could not simply stride across the ballroom and request a dance. He needed an introduction, and not just any introduction, a proper one, facilitated by a mutual acquaintance deemed suitable by the ever-watchful chaperones. The introduction itself was an art form. It unfolded slowly, deliberately. A family, friend, perhaps Lady Abernathy, might notice young Eleanor's glance, and with the faintest tilt of her head, signal approval. She would rise, her silk skirts rustling softly, and make her way, unhurried, to Mr. Pritchard's corner of the room. "Mr. Pritchard," she might say, her voice low, deliberate. "May I present to you Miss Fairchild?" And thus the slow, delicate machinery of Victorian courtship would begin to creak into motion. It is curious, is it not? How something as simple as meeting someone could require so many layers of permission, of ritual, of suffocating slowness. Yet, in the grand halls of Victorian society, that slowness was a kind of safety, a barrier between the individual and the chaos of emotion, a way to manage, to contain the unpredictable nature of human connection within the strict, gilded cage of social decorum. And so our young couple, Eleanor and Jonathan, would now be permitted to share a dance, but not yet. First, they must consult. The dance card, but that is a story for another night. For now, let us leave them there, standing apart, connected by a glance that floats in the thick, perfumed air. The chandeliers still glimmer softly. The orchestra plays on, and the evening continues at its measured, suffocating pace. You may feel your own breath slowing as you drift gently into that endless, languid world where a single glance can stretch. For hours. It is a curious thing to imagine one's romantic destiny resting in the quiet rustle of a small rectangle of ivory-colored paper. And yet, for the young ladies of Victorian England, the dance card was precisely that, a fragile, folded keepsake that dictated, with delicate precision, the rhythm of their social prospects, tied with a silk ribbon, perhaps pale blue or soft lavender, and often adorned with gilt-edged lettering. These cards were far more than charming accessories. They were schedules, meticulously planned, cautiously filled, and guarded with the same reverence one might reserve for a personal diary. Except, of course, they were anything but personal. Everyone noticed your dance card. Everyone watched to see whose names you penciled in, whose were conspicuously absent, and which empty slots betrayed a quiet, social failure. Imagine the scene. A grand ballroom, its polished floors gleaming under. The flickering glow of chandeliers, casting scattered reflections that seemed to dance in lazy spirals across the ceiling. In one corner, a young lady sits, her gloved fingers gently smoothing the edges of her dance card, as though calming a fluttering heart. The air around her hums with a soft symphony of polite conversation, muffled laughter, and the distant strains of a waltz played by an orchestra half hidden behind a screen of potted ferns. Her mother sits beside her, upright and vigilant, her lips curved into a smile that does not quite reach her eyes. For this is not a time for relaxation. This is strategy. The filling of a dance card is no casual affair. It is a careful choreography of alliances, of whispered suggestions, of glances exchanged across the room that may or may not result in a name delicately penciled in beside the fifth quadrille or the seventh waltz. One might imagine that such a card would be filled quickly, in a flurry of eager suitors lining up with earnest requests. But no, the pace is slower, more deliberate, as though each request must pass through an invisible sieve of propriety. A gentleman cannot simply stride up and ask for a dance. He must wait for the right moment, a subtle nod from a mutual acquaintance, a soft word from a chaperone before approaching with the quiet, formal precision that Victorian society so adored. And even then, the offer is tentative, almost fragile, as though the very act of asking carries with it the weight of potential scandal dot picture. If you will, the soft scratch of a quill as a young man's name is written, ever so carefully, onto the card. The ink must dry without smudging. The spacing must be just so. It is not merely about claiming a dance. It is about being seen to claim a dance. Each name, each slot filled, is a small silent declaration to the room, a signal of connections, of family alliances, of social standing carefully maneuvered under the guise of innocent enjoyment. For the young lady, this process is both exhilarating and excruciating. To have too few names on one's card is a quiet humiliation, a tangible symbol of being overlooked, left to sit in a stifling corner as others twirl across the floor. But to have too many eager requests, to appear overly sought after, is equally dangerous. It invites whispers, those faint murmurs behind fluttering fans, questioning a girl's modesty, her sense of propriety. The perfect dance card, then, is one that balances interest with restraint, a delicate equilibrium only achievable through the subtle orchestration of mothers. Aunts and watchful friends who understand the fragile mechanics of social standing. And so the evening meanders on, not in a whirlwind of spontaneous joy, but in a slow, suffocating drift of orchestrated interactions. The rustle of skirts as ladies rise to meet their partners, the soft clink of glasses as refreshments are offered between dances, the faint scraping of chairs as chaperones shift positions to maintain an unobstructed view of their charges. Every sound blends into a gentle, monotonous rhythm. The dance card is consulted often, its ribbon twirling nervously around a gloved finger. Its penciled names a quiet anchor in a sea of carefully controlled chaos. It is perhaps during the intervals, those languid pauses between sets, that the weight of the dance card is most keenly felt. As the orchestra pauses to retune their instruments, as the air thickens with the mingled scents of candle wax and perfume, the young lady's gaze returns to the folded card in her hand. Each name represents a moment preordained, a conversation, rehearsed in advance, a polite smile waiting to be unfurled. There is no room for spontaneity here. No accidental meetings. No serendipitous encounters. Romance, if it is to be found at all, must navigate the narrow pathways etched in faint graphite on a small rectangle of cardstock dot. And for the gentleman, the process is no less tedious. To request a dance is not merely to express interest, but to make a calculated move in the intricate game of social chess. A dance card filled too hastily betrays desperation. A gentleman seen lingering without a partner risks quiet condemnation. Timing is everything. The right dance, requested at the right moment, can open the door to further acquaintance. The wrong choice, the misstep of selecting a less favorable set, could render all efforts quietly void. He must be mindful of the girl's family, of his own standing, of the subtle undercurrents that flow beneath every polite interaction in the room as the evening drifts onward. The dance card begins to tell its own quiet story. Creases form at the edges. The penciled names begin to blur ever so slightly under the warmth of gloved hands. And the once pristine ribbon now bears the soft imprint of fingers that have twisted and untwisted it in nervous anticipation. It becomes, in a way, a diary of the night, a record not of joy and frivolity, but of negotiations, strategies, and careful maneuverings in this world, where a single glance required orchestration. The dance card was both a shield and a constraint. It protected young ladies from the impropriety of unsolicited attention. Yet it also tethered them to a rigid structure where every social interaction was pre-scripted. To hold a dance card was to navigate a social minefield, where a misstep could echo quietly through parlors and tea rooms for weeks to come. And yet, despite the monotony, despite the layers of etiquette wrapped around every penciled name there, was still perhaps a small thrill in the act of writing. The soft scratch of pencil against card, the quiet breath held as a gentleman's name was inscribed, carried with it the faintest flicker of possibility. Not freedom, perhaps, but the semblance of choice, a delicate, fleeting illusion in a world so tightly bound by rules. As the orchestra resumes, as the couples take their places on the floor once more, the dance card is gently folded and tucked away, its contents memorized, its schedule set. The evening will continue in its slow, suffocating grace, each dance a careful performance, each conversation a negotiation wrapped in layers of polite smiles and whispered etiquette. But the card itself, that small, fragile artifact, remains. The silent conductor of it all, guiding each step, each glance, each breath, until the last waltz fades into the perfumed air dot and somewhere folded neatly in a young lady's gloved hand. Her fate, her prospects, and perhaps, though it is unlikely, her heart, are penciled quietly into place. There is a particular stillness that settles over a Victorian parlor in the late afternoon. The kind of stillness that is not born of peace, but of expectation. The kind that hums quietly beneath the soft ticking of a mantel clock, beneath the delicate clink of a silver spoon stirring sugar into a china teacup. In this space, beneath the heavy velvet curtains drawn just so to filter the afternoon light, the tyranny of the chaperone reigns supreme. And tyranny, it must be said, is a fitting word, not in the loud, brash sense of iron fists and stern proclamations, but in the suffocating, ever-watchful way of eyes that see everything and lips that never forget. Imagine, if you will, a small, tastefully furnished parlor in a respectable townhouse in Kensington. The walls are lined with discreetly floral wallpaper. The furniture is upholstered in muted brocades, and the air carries the faintest hint of rosewater, a scent meticulously chosen to be pleasant, but not ostentatious. Upon a delicate settee sits Miss Eleanor Fairchild, our young lady from earlier evenings, her posture impeccable, her gloved hands resting lightly upon her lap. Across from her, in an armchair with lace antimacassars carefully pinned at the corners, sits her mother, Mrs. Fairchild, whose embroidery hoop is positioned just above her lap, though she has not made a single stitch in the past 20 minutes. The needle remains poised, as if at any moment she might resume her delicate work, but in truth, her attention is not upon the floral motif she pretends to craft. It is trained instead upon the gentleman sitting precisely 3 feet away from her daughter. Mr. Jonathan Pritchard, freshly arrived for his afternoon visit, is acutely aware of Mrs. Fairchild's needle, not because it threatens him, but because it marks time, a quiet metronome of polite interrogation. Every word he speaks, every question he poses to Eleanor, is offered with the measured understanding that it will be heard, weighed, and filed away by the matronly figure across the room. The chaperone does not interrupt. That would be vulgar. No, she merely listens, a presence so firmly rooted in propriety that her silence itself is an active participant in a conversation. It is a curious form of surveillance. This chaperoning, unlike the overt guardianship of a prison warden or the formal supervision of a governess, the Victorian chaperone exerts control through stillness, through the unspoken knowledge that no interaction escapes her notice. There are no private whispers, no stolen glances that are not, in some measure, permitted. A young man may inquire after the lady's interests, her fondness for music, perhaps, or the merits of the latest novel by Mr. Dickens, but he does so under the unblinking gaze of a matron whose own courtship days are far behind her, but whose social vigilance remains as sharp as ever. In this stifling arrangement, conversation becomes an exercise in endurance. Small talk is elevated to a delicate art, where every word must tread a line between showing interest and maintaining the fortress of propriety. A jest that veers too far into familiarity, a compliment delivered with a shade too much warmth. These are perils far greater than they appear. For the chaperone listens, and though she may not speak, her silence is as telling as a verdict. One must not imagine, however, that chaperones were mere relics of overprotective motherhood. They were, in many ways, the social currency of their time. To host a visit without a chaperone present would be to invite scandal. To risk the entire structure of a young lady's reputation upon a moment's lapse in decorum. The chaperone's presence was both shield and shackle, a guarantee of respectability, but a guarantee that freedom of conversation, of movement, of emotion would remain tightly bound. Consider the subtle dance of gestures that unfolded in these suffocating parlors. A gentleman may rise to pass a plate of scones, his hand lingering just slightly longer than necessary as the young lady accepts it. A shared glance, perhaps, as the silver tongs pass between them. But such moments, so fleeting, are carefully catalogued by the ever-watchful chaperone, whose eyes never leave the space between them. Even the angle at which a teacup is set down, too precise, too emphatic, can signal a conversation that has ventured into territory deemed too familiar. And yet, within this rigid tableau, there exists a peculiar intimacy. An intimacy born not from privacy, but from shared constraint. The young couple, bound by the invisible walls of etiquette, learns to communicate in the smallest of increments. A smile that flickers for the briefest moment, a polite inquiry framed. With a careful choice of words becomes a meaningful exchange. The frustration, the yearning to simply speak freely, to laugh, to relax, it simmers beneath the surface, shaping their interactions into something at once, suffocating and delicately profound. The chaperone, of course, is not malicious. She is a product of her time, a guardian of a social order where reputation is as fragile as the fine bone china balanced upon the tea table. Her vigilance is not born of suspicion, but of duty. A duty to preserve the delicate balance of propriety that ensures her daughter's place in a world that tolerates no misstep. Yet, her presence casts a long shadow, transforming even the simplest exchange into a quiet performance, where every gesture, every word, is an offering made under silent scrutiny as the afternoon drifts onwards, marked by the soft ticking of the clock and the gentle rustle of pages as Mr. Pritchard compliments the arrangement of books upon the shelf. The weight of the chaperone's gaze never lessens. Time, in this space, stretches. An hour can unfold into what feels like an eternity. Each minute, elongated by the restraint with which it is filled. There is no leaning in, no quiet confession. There is only the endless circling of polite conversation, the careful balancing of interest and distance, all under the unblinking eyes of decorum. And when, at last, the visit draws to its close. The departure is a ritual in itself. Mr. Pritchard will rise, offering a bow that is neither too eager nor too casual, expressing gratitude for the afternoon's delightful conversation. Eleanor will curtsy, her smile polite, her hands folded in a manner that betrays none of the frustration she feels. Mrs. Fairchild will murmur a courteous farewell, her embroidery still untouched, though she has stitched an entire narrative in. Her mind at the door closes, the silence lingers, and Eleanor is left to sit in the fading afternoon light, wondering if, perhaps, her carefully guarded conversation has left any impression at all. But there will be no solitude in which to ponder, for chaperones are ever present, their duty unending, their vigilance as constant as the slow. Measured ticking of the clock upon the mantel in Victorian England, love was never alone. It was always observed, always measured, always framed within the rigid, suffocating presence of a chaperone who ensured that propriety remained unbroken, even as heart strained quietly beneath its weight. Long before text messages and telephone calls, long before hurried emails and impromptu meetings, there was a quiet, dignified ritual of the calling card. A small rectangular piece of heavy cream paper, elegantly engraved with a gentleman's name in looping copperplate script, perhaps adorned with a tasteful border or an understated monogram. In the delicate world of Victorian courtship, this unassuming card was not merely a token of politeness, it was the first cautious step in a slow and labyrinthine journey toward romance. A gesture so subtle, so bound in etiquette, that even its delivery was a study in quiet restraint. It is. Late morning in a respectable London townhouse. The household has been astir since dawn. Yet the drawing room remains a place of suspended anticipation. The butler, immaculately dressed in black with starched white cuffs, stands ready by the entrance hall. His gloved hand holds a silver salver, polished to such a gleam that the faint morning light filtering through stained glass seems to linger upon its surface. Upon this tray rests a small, carefully arranged selection of calling cards. Some have been delivered already today, others from the previous afternoon. Each card carries with it a quiet weight, a message wrapped not in words but in presence, or perhaps more accurately, in the hope of being permitted a future presence. For the gentleman, the act of leaving a calling card is a ritual of almost monastic calm. He does not knock, nor does he expect to be received. His visit is not a visit at all, but an offering. He steps from his carriage, ascends the stone steps of the townhouse with careful, unhurried strides, and upon being greeted by the butler, presents his card with a slight formal bow. He may leave one card for the lady of the house, perhaps, one for her daughter, and, if tradition demands, a third card folded in half to indicate his intention to call in person, should the family permit. He does not linger. The exchange is brief, nearly wordless. The true conversation, after all, will happen later, within drawing rooms and parlors, as the household quietly inspects the delicate stack of cards arranged upon the silver tray dotted. Is a scene repeated in countless homes, countless mornings, a quiet parade of suitors and social acquaintances, each leaving behind their small paper tokens like petals dropped upon a carefully swept path. The rustle of cards being shuffled, the faint flutter as edges are aligned, the subdued clearing of a butler's throat as he announces the latest delivery. These are the sounds of a Victorian courtship in its earliest stage. Not words, not confessions of affection, but a silent procession of names etched in ink, waiting to be acknowledged dot for the young lady of the house. The appearance of a particular card can send a ripple through an otherwise uneventful morning. The name itself may be familiar and new, but what matters most is not the mere presence of the card, but what happens next. Will her mother choose to acknowledge it? Will an invitation for a return visit be extended? Or will the card be quietly set aside, its message left unanswered, its potential quietly withering away beneath a stack of more socially advantageous suitors? There's no direct communication in this exchange, no certainty. A gentleman leaves his card, and then he waits and waits. Days may pass. Weeks even. The only response may be the faint rustle of invitation cards being delivered to others, while his own name remains unspoken. It is a courtship of patience, where initiative must bow to the slow machinery of social protocol, even to hope for. A return visit is to hope cautiously, for the invitation, when it comes, is wrapped not in affection but in propriety. When a card is accepted, the next step is no less constrained. The gentleman may be invited to call during the family's designated at home hours in a narrow window of late afternoon when polite society allows for formal visits. He will not arrive early, for that would seem too eager, nor too late, for that would suggest indifference. Timing in this world is as finely tuned as the engravings upon the card itself. The scene within the parlor is as choreographed as any grand ball. The gentleman will be received in a space designed for conversation that hovers forever on the surface. The young lady, accompanied as always by her chaperone, will engage in polite discourse, while the butler ensures that tea is served with the precise clink of silver spoons against porcelain. The calling card has done its work. It has secured a foot within the door, but nothing more. The true labor of courtship still lies ahead, buried beneath layers of conversation so formal, so delicate that even a misplaced comment on the weather might tip the balance. For all its silence, the calling card is a profoundly public instrument. In many households, the cards are displayed openly upon a small table in the entrance hall, arranged with a kind of deliberate casualness that reveals precisely what it intends to hide. Visitors will glance and perhaps note which names appear prominently and which are tucked slightly out of sight. Gossip is born not merely from who leaves a card, but from whose card is visibly acknowledged. For the gentleman, The waiting is a study in endurance. There's no following up, no impromptu visits to inquire after the card's reception. His interest must be expressed only through the quiet repetition of this ritual, the periodic delivery of fresh cards, each one a silent question. May I be permitted to know you better? And yet, for all this effort, the answer may be no more than a soft sigh from a mother as she turns the card face down upon the tray, ensuring that its name will never find a place upon the family's visiting list. For the young lady, the process is no less tedious. To receive a card is to be placed into a liminal space, not engaged, not pursued, merely available. The decision lies not with her, but with the matriarchs who manage the invisible threads of social propriety. And so she watches quietly as her fate flutters gently upon a silver tray, jostled alongside the cards of men who may be suitable in name but not in heart dot in this ritual. Romance is not the grand gesture of flowers or serenades, but the quiet persistence of paper and ink, the slow accumulation of names that may one day lead to a conversation, a visit, a chance to sit in the same room beneath the watchful eyes of a chaperone. The calling card is not a declaration, it is an introduction, a request for acknowledgement in a world where every step toward intimacy is layered in silence. And yet, for all its stiffness, there's a certain poetry to this slow, deliberate dance. To think that a relationship could begin not with bold words or hurried confessions, but with the simple, quiet placement of a card upon a silver tray, a gesture so small it might seem inconsequential, and yet, within the bounds of Victorian society, it was everything. It was presence. It was intention. It was the opening note of a symphony played at the softest possible volume. As the afternoon sun shifts, casting long dappled shadows across the parlor floor, the calling cards remain, unmoving yet filled with potential. Their presence is a silent conversation between households, a dialogue of names and intentions, exchanged not with voices but with the faint rustle of heavy cardstock beneath gloved fingers. And somewhere, in a drawing room filled with the quiet clink of tea being poured, a young lady glances toward the silver tray and wonders which, if any, of those pale rectangles might one day lead to something resembling love. There is a certain kind of quiet that only exists in a Victorian drawing room during afternoon tea. It is not the peaceful quiet of solitude, nor is it the bustling quiet of a house going about its business. It is a stifled, expectant quiet, where every sound is magnified, the soft clink of a silver spoon stirring sugar into tea, the delicate crackle of a scone being broken apart with gloved fingers, the faint rhythmic ticking of a mantel clock marking each passing second, as if time itself has grown weary of the conversation. This is the setting where Victorian courtship, such as it was, often found itself gently suffocating beneath the weight of manners and the endless repetitive rituals of polite society. The young lady, let us call her Miss Eleanor Fairchild, once more, for she has become our steadfast companion in this meandering tale, sits poised at the edge of a brocade-upholstered settee. Her silk skirts arranged just so, her gloved hands folded neatly in her lap. Across from her, perched upon a rather uncomfortable-looking chair with barely any room for adjustment, sits Mr. Jonathan Pritchard, who has, at last, after weeks of calling cards and supervised walks, been invited for the supreme ordeal that is afternoon tea. The table between them, though modest in size, is a battlefield of etiquette. A silver teapot, its spout polished to a glimmer. A matching sugar bowl with tiny tongs. A delicate plate of scones, half of which are already disintegrating. Under the weight of clotted cream and social expectation, the conversation begins, as it always does, with the weather. Not because either party has any profound observations about the atmospheric conditions, but because it is the safest topic in a world where impropriety lurks behind every unscripted remark. Mr. Pritchard inquires whether Miss Fairchild finds the August heat oppressive, to which she responds that it has indeed been rather warm of late. The exchange is as light as the steam rising from their teacups. A thin veil of words draped over the true silence that pulses beneath. Neither wishes to appear dull, but neither dares stray into the dangerous waters of personal opinion. And so they circle politely, tediously, around subjects that matter very little. Their conversation as fragile and breakable as the porcelain cups they cradle, tea itself becomes a performance. The pouring of it, in particular, is an exercise in composure. Miss Fairchild, having been trained since childhood in the precise angle of the wrist, the measured grace of lifting the teapot, tilts it ever so slightly, allowing the amber liquid to stream into Mr. Pritchard's cup without a single improper spill. Mr. Pritchard, in turn, watches with an attentiveness that borders on reverence, not because the act itself is fascinating, but because it is one of the few moments where he is permitted to observe her hands, her posture, her delicate concentration without the need for words. In Victorian courtship, so many things were said in silence. The scones, too, are fraught with unspoken rules. One must never bite directly into a whole scone, lest they wish to appear uncouth. Instead, it is broken gently, fingers careful not to leave crumbs upon the pristine linen napkin resting upon one's lap. Clotted cream is applied first, or is it jam? The debate lingers quietly in polite society, though it is of little consequence here. The important thing is to avoid any smearing, any mésalliances that might betray a lack of refinement. As they each delicately assemble their scone, their eyes may meet briefly, a flicker of shared amusement passing between them, though not too much, of course. Even smiles must be measured. Perhaps Mr. Pritchard ventures a question about music. Does Miss Fairchild play the pianoforte? She does, of course, as any well-bred young lady must. And so she speaks in soft, evenly measured tones about her recent practice pieces, Mozart, perhaps, or a genteel arrangement of a popular waltz. He will not ask what she truly enjoys playing. That would be far too forward. Instead, he might offer a mild compliment, something about how delightful it must be to hear music filling this very room. Miss Fairchild will smile politely, though both of them know that such an occasion will not occur until much, much later, when propriety allows for more than these excruciatingly polite exchanges. Throughout all of this, Mrs. Fairchild presides. From her armchair in the corner, she does not participate, not overtly. Yet her presence is as tangible as the tea tray itself. Her needlework rests upon her lap, though her fingers rarely move. She listens, she watches, she weighs. Every comment made by Mr. Pritchard is, in effect, addressed to her as much as to her daughter. Every question he poses must pass through the invisible sieve of her approval. If his compliments are too effusive, she will note it. If his conversation drifts too close to personal matters, she will intervene, perhaps with a gentle clearing of the throat or a subtle shift in posture. The chaperone does not speak to direct the conversation. Her mere presence is enough to ensure its boundaries. The clock ticks on. Conversations drift from the weather to the garden, from music to the latest charity bazaar, and occasionally to literary matters, though cautiously, lest opinions reveal too much. The tone remains light, the topic superficial, yet beneath. This practiced banter lies a quiet, shared frustration. For Mr. Pritchard, the afternoon feels like walking a tightrope suspended above a sea of scandal. For Miss Fairchild, it is a test of patience, of endurance, of presenting herself as charming and gracious within the strict confines of what she is permitted to say. And even the act of refilling a teacup becomes a subtle language. When Miss Fairchild pours a second cup for Mr. Pritchard, it is a quiet signal that his company is still welcome, that within the parameters of this rigid ceremony, the conversation may continue. But it is not a sign of affection, at least. Not one that can be acknowledged openly. There are no flirtatious glances, no whispered jokes. Every sentiment must be wrapped in layers of propriety, diffused through the tepid water of social etiquette. And so, tea time lingers, the air grows, heavy not with passion, but with a kind of shared resignation. Both participants know the script, know their lines, and yet neither can escape the quiet longing for a moment of unscripted authenticity. They will not find it here. Afternoon tea is not a stage for declarations, but for endurance, a test of who can maintain the facade the longest without faltering when the visit concludes. It does so with the same quiet precision with which it began. Mr. Pritchard will rise, offer a bow, and express his gratitude for the delightful company. Miss Fairchild will respond with a graceful curtsy, her face composed, her thoughts swirling quietly beneath the surface. The tea tray will be cleared away, the crumbs brushed from the linen cloth, and the drawing room will fall back into its customary stillness. Another visit completed. Another carefully measured step in a courtship that feels less like the blossoming of romance and more like an elaborate dance of patience. In the world of Victorian courtship, flirting was not a matter of whispered confidences or secret notes slipped beneath doors. It was an exercise in restraint, a subtle game played over the clink of teacups and the soft rustle of napkins. Every glance, every carefully chosen word was a pebble cast into a vast, still pond. Its ripples barely noticeable, yet essential in moving the courtship forward. One tedious, excruciatingly polite visit at a time. In a world where words were so carefully rationed, where every conversation was supervised and every sentiment filtered through layers of decorum. Victorian ladies and gentlemen found other ways to communicate silent. Subtle ways? Among these, fashion stood quietly yet powerfully as its own kind of language. A language not spoken aloud, yet understood by those who knew how to read its codes. In the hushed parlors and glacially paced promenades of courtship, even the smallest detail, a ribbon, a glove, a carefully chosen hat feather, could carry meanings that were never written but always noticed. Imagine. For a moment, Miss Eleanor Fairchild, standing before the tall, narrow mirror in her bedchamber. The morning light seeps in through lace curtains, casting a soft glow across the room as she adjusts the delicate folds of her dress. The fabric rustles, a whisper of silk, a murmur of tulle as she smooths her skirt into place. Her maid, silent and meticulous, fastens the final buttons at the back, her fingers moving with practiced care. Today is a day of calling visits, and though Eleanor may only exchange a handful of words with a particular gentleman, her attire will speak volumes. To the casual observer, the ensemble is simply elegant. A dove-gray walking dress, modestly adorned with fine embroidery, paired with soft ivory gloves and a parasol of lace, so delicate it seems spun from cobwebs. Yet beneath this carefully constructed simplicity lies a quiet strategy. The shade of gray, chosen not for its neutrality but for its understated grace, suggests a demure yet tasteful personality. The gloves, though pale, are not stark white, an intentional choice that signals refinement without ostentation. And then, of course, there is the hat. Hats in Victorian courtship were not mere accessories. They were billboards of intention, coated with subtle messages. Eleanor's hat today is a charming bonnet, lined with satin and trimmed with a narrow ribbon of pale rose. But what catches the eye, should anyone dare to look too long, is the single feather that curves gently from its side, a soft plume of robin's egg blue. It is not vivid enough to be considered bold, yet distinct enough to catch the attention of a gentleman attuned to such delicate signals. In the unspoken lexicon of Victorian fashion, a feather of such color could suggest openness, a quiet willingness to be noticed, not overtly, but just enough to send a ripple through the sea of social formality. Jonathan Pritchard. Should he happen to encounter Miss Fairchild on our afternoon walk, will most certainly notice the feather. He will not comment upon it directly. That would be uncouth. But he will observe and perhaps allow himself the smallest of smiles, knowing that the choice of such an accessory was no accident. In the society where a misplaced word could spell disaster, a well-placed feather could carry the weight of an entire conversation. It was not only feathers, of course. The language of fashion extended to fans, gloves, jewelry, and even the particular angle at which a bonnet was tied. A fan held open at a certain degree might suggest interest, while a fan fluttered too quickly could imply discomfort. A lady who removed her gloves during a visit was, depending on the timing, either signaling familiarity or committing a grave faux pas. Jewelry, too, was carefully curated. A simple locket worn just beneath the collarbone, half hidden yet perceptible, could whisper of sentimentality, while a more ornate brooch might hint at familial pride or social standing, yet the subtlety of this language was also its challenge. Every gesture had to be executed with perfect restraint. To allow a ribbon to sit at an improper angle, to let a glove's button remain unfastened, to choose a shade of silk that veered too bright, these were errors that could ignite small, simmering waves of gossip, eroding a young lady's carefully cultivated image before she ever had a chance to speak her mind. For gentlemen, the choices were fewer but no less fraught. A waistcoat in a shade too daring could be seen as flamboyant, a cravat tied too loosely as careless. The gleam of a signet ring, the sheen of a well-polished boot, even the precise fold of a pocket handkerchief, all these details could suggest attention to decorum, or a dangerous lack thereof. To dress oneself was, in effect, to compose a sentence in silence, with each accessory functioning as a verb or an adjective, subtly conveying interest, caution, or disinterest. And yet, for all its rigidity, there was a kind of artistry to it. For young women like Miss Fairchild, who navigated a social landscape where overt expression was stifled at every turn, fashion offered a canvas upon which to sketch her desires with the lightest of strokes. A change of bonnet, a new pair, gloves, the deliberate choice of a silk sash tied a fraction more loosely at the waist. These were acts of quiet rebellion, though delicate agency. It was a dance of hints, where the boldest move was a glance toward a hat feather swaying gently. In the breeze, consider the promenade in Hyde Park, a favorite venue for such visual conversations. Here, amidst the slow circuit of carriages and pedestrians, fashion became a theater. Mothers and chaperones might occupy the seats along the path, ostensibly focused on the floral displays or the latest editions of the Ladies' Gazette, but their eyes, like those of their charges, were finely tuned to every flutter of lace, every strategic adjustment on the parasol. A gentleman, observing from a distance, might note the color of a young lady's shawl, mentally recalling whether it had been worn during their last meeting. Was it a coincidence? Or was it a carefully chosen signal? The beauty of fashion as a language lay in its deniability. Should a comment ever be made, should a mother or aunt raise an eyebrow, the young lady could always feign innocence. Oh, this old bonnet? I hadn't thought much of it. And yet, beneath the soft brush of feathers and the faint shimmer of silk, a message had already been delivered, received, and understood. There was, of course, an exhausting precision to it all. For every young woman, dressing for a simple afternoon visit became an act of calculation. The choice of what to wear was less about personal taste and more about navigating a web of expectations. Coded meanings and subtle signals. Each garment was a word, each accessory a phrase, carefully assembled into a sentence that must say, "Notice me, but never, I am noticing you." As the afternoon wanes and the golden light deepens, Miss Fairchild returns home, her robin's egg feather still. Swaying gently, the day's silent conversations now folded away alongside her gloves. She has not spoken of affection, nor has Mr. Pritchard declared it, but in the quiet dance of fabric and color, of ribbons and feathers, a conversation has taken place all the same. A conversation that exists only in glances, in the shared language. Of those who know how to read what is never said aloud, in Victorian England, where words were scarce and propriety abundant, fashion became not only a statement of status, but the only acceptable form of romantic expression. In every swish of a silk skirt, in every carefully chosen hat feather, love whispered softly. If one only knew how to listen, there's a peculiar quietness to a Victorian promenade. The kind of stillness that hums just beneath the soft crunch of gravel underfoot, beneath the gentle swish of skirts and the rhythmic tapping of walking sticks against carefully raked pathways. It is not a silence born of solitude, but of observation. Every glance, every step, every politely measured word floats into an atmosphere thick with chaperone watchfulness. For young couples in Victorian England, the act of taking a walk together was never quite the leisurely, romantic stroll that later centuries would imagine. It was a supervised, strategic ritual, one more cautious step, and the elaborate waltz of courtship. Imagine. For a moment, Miss Eleanor Fairchild, clad in her walking dress of pale lavender, its fabric fluttering gently in the breeze as she steps into the manicured paths of Hyde Park. At her side, precisely 3 paces behind, her mother walks with quiet vigilance. On this particular afternoon, Mr. Jonathan Pritchard has been granted the singular privilege of joining them. But this is no private encounter, no opportunity for whispered confidences beneath a bough of trees. No, this is a promenade where privacy is both impossible and improper, and where every word exchanged is filtered through the suffocating presence of chaperones. And the ever-watchful eyes of society dot their steps a line as they begin their stroll, a slow looping circuit around the Serpentine, where dozens of other couples perform the same intricate dance. The gravel path crunches softly beneath their shoes, Eleanor's delicate boots making a faint scuffing sound, while Mr. Pritchard's polished soles offer a more decisive tread. Between them, a carefully measured distance is maintained, neither too close to suggest undue familiarity, nor too far to imply disinterest. This invisible line, this breath of space, is as much a part of the conversation as the words they exchange, and what words they are. The subjects, as always, are meticulously safe. The weather, of course, must be addressed first. Today's breeze is noted as refreshing, though not so brisk as to require a heavier shawl. The flowers along the path are admired for their orderly blooms, and Mr. Pritchard may venture a mild compliment on Miss Fairchild's taste in dairy towels. Every topic is a stepping stone, carefully placed to avoid the treacherous waters of personal sentiment. There is a peculiar art to such conversation, where saying nothing of consequence becomes the height of propriety. Mrs. Fairchild follows at a discreet but unmistakable distance, her parasol tilted at just the right angle to shield her face from the sun, while affording her a clear view of every movement, every glance exchanged. She does not intrude, for intrusion is unnecessary. Her mere presence is a silent reminder of the boundaries in place. Other chaperones pass by in similar formation, like ships in calm waters, each maintaining their course with dignified vigilance. As they walk, the rhythm of their steps becomes a quiet accompaniment to their conversation. There is no arm to be offered, no hands to brush against one another. Such gestures belong to a later stage, if they are permitted at all. For now, the only connection is through words and the briefest of glances. When Mr. Pritchard speaks of a recent charity event, his eyes may flicker just briefly toward Eleanor's face, seeking a reaction. Eleanor, in turn, will respond with a small, composed smile, a tilt of the head that suggests both interest and perfect propriety. And beneath this exchange, a shared undercurrent of frustration simmers. Though it never quite breaches the surface, the promenade itself becomes a kind of stage where every participant plays their role. Nearby, a group of ladies feigns deep conversation, though their eyes discreetly scan the passers-by. A pair of elderly gentlemen, seated upon an iron bench, watches with the quiet amusement of those who have long since outgrown these rituals. Children dart about under the watchful gaze of governesses, their laughter adding a fragile, fleeting spontaneity to a otherwise rigid tableau. What makes these strolls so endlessly tedious, yet so essential, is their sheer predictability. Each turn of the path is like a line in a well-rehearsed script. There will be pauses to admire a particularly lovely cluster of roses. There will be moments when Mr. Pritchard must step aside to allow another party to pass, offering a polite bow, his conversation momentarily suspended. There will be the ever-present awareness that though they walk together, they are never truly alone. Their words must fill the space where genuine connection might otherwise reside, carefully avoiding any breach of etiquette that might ripple through the community. Like an unspoken scandal, even the setting conspires to maintain this atmosphere of controlled decorum, The trees, though leafy and abundant, cast no shadows dark enough to hide within. The park's design, with its broad, open paths and lack of secluded nooks, ensures that every interaction remains in full view of society. Privacy in these walks is an illusion, a fantasy that must be content with the fleeting intimacy of a shared observation about the day's weather or a mutual appreciation of a distant swan gliding across the lake dot. And yet, within these limitations, there exists a peculiar kind of intimacy. When words are rationed and gestures forbidden, a simple glance can carry the weight of a paragraph. A slightly longer pause before responding, a faint inflection in the voice, these become the tools. Of subtle expression, Mr. Pritchard may never dare to say that he finds Eleanor's company delightful. But the way his tone softens when he remarks upon the lavender of her dress speaks volumes to a listener attuned to such quiet nuances. The walk continues, looping back upon itself, tracing the same gravel path over and over, as if Victorian courtship, or quite literally an exercise in going in circles. With each circuit, the conversation may grow incrementally more familiar, yet it never quite breaks free of its rigid structure. There is a shared understanding that this ritual must be endured, that the slow, repetitive promenade is a necessary prelude to any deeper connection that might, in some distant future, be permitted to blossom as the afternoon light begins to soften, casting a golden haze over the park. Mrs. Fairchild will gently signal that it is time to conclude the walk. Perhaps it is a slight adjustment of her parasol, or the faintest nod in Eleanor's direction. The promenade, like the visit, must not extend beyond its allotted time. Lest propriety be strained, Mr. Pritchard will offer a polite farewell, perhaps with a bow just a fraction deeper than before, while Eleanor will respond with a curtsy as precise as it is impersonal, and yet, as they part ways, there is a subtle satisfaction beneath the tedium. They have navigated another step in the labyrinth of Victorian courtship, adhered to every rule, exchanged no improper words, and yet, in their quiet, measured way, they have inched infinitesimally closer to understanding each other. A walk in circles. Yes, but circles, after all, do have a center, even if reaching it requires endless revolutions around the well-trodden paths of etiquette in the world of Victorian courtship. The supervised stroll was less an opportunity for romance, and more a test of patience. And yet, beneath the layers of formality, beneath the endless crunch of gravel and the measured cadence of polite conversation, there lived a quiet, persistent hope that one day these circles might finally lead somewhere in an age where every glance was monitored, where conversations floated politely atop a sea of unspoken thoughts. The love letter stood as one of the few outlets for genuine sentiment. But even then, in the carefully controlled world of Victorian courtship, a love letter was less a private confession and more a delicate performance. A written overture that, far from being whispered between two hearts, passed through a labyrinth of hands and eyes before ever reaching its intended recipient. The image of a gentleman, quill poised over a parchment, crafting lines of affection in the soft glow of a candlelit study, is a romantic one. Yet, in reality, this act was steeped in as much caution as the stiffest parlor visit. Picture Mr. Jonathan Pritchard seated at his writing desk late in the afternoon. The window is cracked open just enough to admit a faint breeze, rustling the edge of the fine stationery laid before him. He dips his quill into the inkpot, pausing as he considers the opening line. Not too familiar, lest it seem presumptuous. Not too cold, lest it seem indifferent. Every word must be weighed and measured, not only for how it might be received by Miss Eleanor Fairchild, but more crucially for how it might be interpreted by the guardians who would inevitably intercept it. A letter in Victorian courtship was never truly private. It was a message delivered first to gatekeepers, mothers, aunts, governesses, before it ever whispered its contents into the ears of the beloved. The quill's tip glides across the paper with a soft rhythmic scratch, a sound that fills the study with a quiet, contemplative pulse. Mr. Pritchard writes slowly, cautiously, Miss Fairchild, I trust this letter finds you in good health and fine spirits. Already, The letter is less a note of passion and more an exercise in social fencing. He may wish to express his admiration, his longing, perhaps even his frustration with the endless chaperone visits and circular walks. But such sentiments must be buried beneath layers of respectable phrases. Every sentence is like a parcel wrapped in polite ribbon, concealing its true contents within, when the letter is at last complete. Signed with a flourish that hints at formality rather than fervor, it is sealed, the wax carefully pressed with a signet ring that seems to add yet another layer of distance between writer and reader. But Mr. Pritchard knows his words have only begun their journey. He will entrust the letter to his family's footman, who, with all the ceremony of a diplomatic envoy, will deliver it not to Miss Fairchild directly, but to the household butler. The letter is received upon a silver salver, carried through the stately halls of the Fairchild residence, where it will rest briefly in a small, elaborately carved letter box in the drawing room, a purgatory for correspondence where notes waited. To be judged worthy of presentation, Mrs. Fairchild will be the first to open it. The faint crackle of the seal breaking, the gentle unfurling of the folded paper, becomes an event in itself. She reads slowly, her lips moving faintly, scanning not just for content but for subtext. She is not searching for declarations of affection that would be improper, but for the tone, the cadence, the balance between formality and warmth. A letter too bold might see itself quietly returned, unread by Eleanor. A letter too cold would be deemed unworthy of reply. Only the perfect composition of polite interest, framed with respectful admiration, will pass through this gatekeeping stage. Assuming Mrs. Fairchild finds the letter acceptable, it will be handed to Eleanor during an appropriate moment, perhaps after breakfast, as she sits in the morning room beneath the filtered light of tall windows. The letter arrives not as a secret missive, but as a formal invitation for consideration. Eleanor receives it with a carefully neutral expression, her fingers moving delicately as she unfolds the page. Even now, she is aware that her reaction may be observed. To smile too readily would suggest undue eagerness. To set it aside untouched would risk seeming dismissive. She reads with the serene composure expected of a young lady, her pulse quickening. Beneath her calm exterior dot, and then comes the next stage, the crafting of a reply. Eleanor retreats to her writing desk, a smaller and more delicate piece of furniture, adorned with tiny drawers filled with fine paper, sealing wax, and quills sharpened to precise points. Here she must compose a response, a task that requires the same careful balancing act as Mr. Pritchard's original letter. She must appear gracious, interested, but not overly familiar. A tone of polite reserve must veil any personal feeling, and even the choice of words whether she hoped Mr. Pritchard's health continues to be robust or finds him well and contented is weighed for its propriety. Once the reply is sealed and entrusted to the household staff, it embarks upon the same circuitous journey back to Mr. Pritchard, through butlers and footmen, through corridors and carriages, until at last it rests upon his writing desk, where he will open it with the same careful composure. There is, in this exchange, a profound patience required, a willingness to pour one's thoughts into words, knowing they will drift slowly, cautiously, through a sea of intermediaries before ever reaching their true destination. Unlike the breathless dispatches of later generations, Victorian love letters did not rush toward their recipient. They meandered. A letter might take days to arrive, days more for a reply to be composed and returned. In that long pause between sending and receiving, affection simmered quietly, wrapped in anticipation. The very slowness of the process seemed to echo the glacial pace of courtship itself, where every step was measured, every advance buffered by decorum. And yet, despite or perhaps because of this drawn-out ritual, a love letter held a certain weight. It was a tangible thing, crafted by hand, bearing the physical trace of its author. The slight smudge where the ink was not quite dry, the faintest indentation where a quill pressed a little too firmly, the subtle scent of the paper mingling with wax and candle smoke. These were details that no chaperone, however watchful, could erase. They were perhaps the only fragments of unfiltered intimacy permitted in a courtship bound by so many rules. But even so, the love letter remained a public artifact masquerading as private. It was a message whispered across a crowded room, a glance exchanged beneath the shadow of a chaperone's parasol. Every word was crafted with the knowledge that it might be read by many before ever reaching its intended heart. And yet, within those boundaries, affection found a way to thread itself through. Delicately, patiently dot as evening descends and the last letter of the day is folded and sealed. The quiet ritual of writing becomes, in itself, a meditation on endurance. Victorian love letters were never hurried, never impulsive. They were slow, methodical testaments to a courtship that valued patience above all else. A letter that passed through so many hands before it reached its destination was not diminished by the journey. It was, in its own way, strengthened by it. There is something profoundly ceremonial about Victorian family dinner, not merely in the polished silverware or the meticulously folded napkins, but in the atmosphere itself, thick with silent expectations. For a young gentleman invited to dine with the family of his chosen lady. The evening promised neither the intimacy of shared laughter nor the comfort of relaxed conversation. Instead, it was a polite battleground where every gesture, every phrase, every delicate handling of a fork became a quiet test of character. A dinner invitation was not a casual event. It was a subtle, high-stakes examination conducted beneath the soft glow of candlelight and the rustled damask tablecloths. Imagine, for a moment, Mr. Jonathan Pritchard standing at the entrance of the Fairchild residence, brushing a final, invisible speck of dust from his waistcoat as he waits to be announced. Beyond the door lies the dining room, a room not merely of meals, but of judgments. Eleanor Fairchild, seated at her designated place beside her mother, awaits with the same composed expression she has worn through countless such evenings, though she knows well that tonight the eyes of her family will rest a little more keenly upon the guest. The room itself is a study in genteel restraint, walls adorned with modest landscapes, a chandelier whose crystals glint softly in the dimming twilight, and a long mahogany table polished to a mirror-like sheen. The air is scented faintly with beeswax and the comforting aroma of roast beef. A culinary centerpiece, as solid and unyielding as Victorian propriety itself, as Mr. Pritchard is ushered in. Introductions are exchanged with a formality so rehearsed it might as well have been scripted. A bow, a curtsy, a handshake, all performed with the serene grace expected of a society that values appearances above ease. He is offered a chair not beside Eleanor, but at a respectful distance, across the table where conversation can flow, but never too freely. Here, in the flickering candlelight, the evening's subtle interrogation begins. The first course is served with a delicate clatter of china, the soft sound of soup spoons stirring gently through a consomme that glimmers. With polite expectations, conversation begins, as always, with safe topics, the weather, the state of the gardens, perhaps a brief, non-controversial mention of a recent charity event. Every question posed by Mr. Fairchild, every remark offered by an aunt or elder sister, is less about genuine interest and more about observing how Mr. Pritchard navigates the treacherous terrain of polite discourse. Does he answer with sufficient deference? Does he maintain the right balance of wit and reserve? Does he know when to speak and, perhaps more importantly, when to listen? As the soup bowls are cleared with the soft scrape of porcelain against wood, the main course arrives, a generous joint of roast beef, its juices glistening as the butler carves with practiced precision. The act of serving becomes its own silent test. Mr. Pritchard must accept his portion with gratitude, not presumption. He must avoid the vulgarity of requesting a specific cut, and his praise of the meal must be enthusiastic, yet never effusive. A gentleman's taste, after all, must be discerning but never flamboyant. Throughout the meal, the table becomes a theater of minor gestures. A misplaced elbow, an improperly wielded knife, a too loud sip of claret, each is noted, if not remarked upon. The careful way Mr. Pritchard cuts his beef, his measured pace of dining, his attentive, but not overly familiar. Glances toward Eleanor. All these are subtle indicators. Clues read with quiet expertise by Mrs. Fairchild, who needs no words to assess his suitability. Eleanor herself, though seated in silence more often than not, is keenly aware of the undercurrents flowing beneath every utterance, every pause. For her, the evening is a peculiar performance where she is both participant and observer. Dessert arrives perhaps as delicate syllabub or meticulously arranged fruit tart, its presentation as carefully composed as the conversation that accompanies it. By now, if Mr. Pritchard has conducted himself well, the dialogue may loosen ever so slightly. A humorous anecdote, a compliment directed, though indirectly, at Eleanor's taste in music or literature might be allowed. Yet, even in these moments, the boundaries remain clear, the tone always tempered with the knowledge that sincerity must be masked in a veil of formal decorum. What makes these dinners so stifling is not the lack of conversation, but the overwhelming awareness of what is left unsaid. Beneath the polite inquiries and graceful toasts lies a constant, unspoken evaluation. Mr. Pritchard is not merely dining. He is presenting his character for inspection. His manners are weighed, his opinions measured, his very presence dissected through a lens of social expectation. A misplaced remark, a clumsy attempt at humor, could shift the entire evening's delicate balance. As coffee is served in the drawing room. The formal phase of the evening begins to wane, but the scrutiny does not. Eleanor may be permitted to play a few pieces on the pianoforte, her hands gliding over the keys in a performance as much for her family's guests as for herself. Mr. Pritchard, seated at a safe distance, listens attentively, his applause measured yet sincere. The evening closes with a final polite exchange, an expression of gratitude for the invitation. A hope for future meetings, all wrapped in phrases so refined. They reveal nothing yet imply everything. Once the front door closes behind Mr. Pritchard. The true discussions begin, not between him and Eleanor, but within the family circle. In the quiet aftermath of the dinner, the family's verdict will be formed. Was he attentive enough? Did he display the right degree of modest confidence? Was his knowledge of literature adequate without being pedantic? Eleanor's opinion may be consulted, though her input is rarely decisive. In the world of Victorian courtship, the family dinner is not merely a shared meal. It is a crucible where a suitor's worth is tested against the silent. Suffocating standards of society. For Mr. Pritchard and Miss Fairchild, the dinner has passed in a blur of controlled expressions and measured words. And yet, despite the rigid framework, there lingers a faint sense of accomplishment. To have survived an evening of roast beef and quiet examinations is, in itself, a step forward and inching closer within the maze of Victorian etiquette. Though no promises are made, no feelings confessed, both know that, in the world they inhabit, endurance is a form of affection. The family dinner may have solved nothing, but it has, in its own tedious way, allowed the courtship to proceed one carefully scrutinized step at a time. If a young man in Victorian England imagined that proposing marriage was an act of sweeping romance, a sudden, heartfelt declaration beneath a moonlit sky, he was in for a tedious awakening. The proposal, that moment so often dramatized in novels, was in reality a formal procedure, a carefully choreographed sequence of permissions, announcements, and ritualized visits. Far from being a spontaneous gesture of affection, a Victorian engagement was less a surprise and more a series of official permissions slipping quietly into place, like documents filed away in a solicitor's office. Consider Mr. Jonathan Pritchard, now several months into his courtship of Miss Eleanor Fairchild. He has danced under watchful eyes, sat through stifling teas, survived the quiet trials of family dinners, and penned countless love letters that have passed through more hands than he cares to count. The time has come, he believes, to propose marriage. Yet, rather than approaching Eleanor with an earnest plea of devotion, he must first navigate the dense thicket of familial propriety. In truth, his proposal does not begin with Eleanor at all. It begins with her father, The request for permission is its own solemn ritual. Mr. Pritchard, in his most formal attire, arrives at the Fairchild home not for a romantic meeting, but for a private audience with Mr. Fairchild, a conversation conducted in the somber quiet of the study. The room is lined with heavy bookshelves and smells faintly of pipe tobacco and aged paper. Here, beneath the gaze of oil portraits depicting long-dead ancestors, Mr. Pritchard must state his intentions with the precision of a man submitting a business proposal. He must speak of his admiration for Eleanor, of course, but more importantly, he must outline his own qualifications, his income, his prospects, his family standing. These details are not mere formalities. They are the true currency of Victorian. Marriage. Mr. Fairchild listens with a measured nod, his fingers steepled beneath his chin. He does not ask about love. Such sentiments are assumed to exist quietly in the background, like the faint ticking of the grandfather clock in the corner. His concerns are practical. Can Mr. Pritchard provide for Eleanor in the manner she deserves? Are his connections respectable? His future stable? This conversation is not emotional, but transactional. A negotiation conducted with the utmost politeness. Assuming Mr. Fairchild is satisfied, and only then Mr. Pritchard will be granted permission to formally propose to Eleanor. Yet even this act is not a private exchange of hearts, but rather a meticulously orchestrated event. A proposal expected to occur within the family's home, often in the drawing room or garden, during a time when other family members are conveniently nearby, though discreetly out of earshot. Privacy in Victorian courtship is always a carefully controlled illusion. On the appointed day, Eleanor might be seated by the window, arranging a small vase of flowers when Mr. Pritchard approaches with the quiet formality of a man delivering official correspondence. The words he speaks are carefully chosen, phrases that acknowledge the solemnity of the occasion more than the depth of his feeling. Miss Fairchild, he may begin, it would be the greatest honor of my life if you would consent to become my wife. Eleanor, having anticipated this moment through countless parlor visits and coded glances, responds with equal composure, perhaps with a quiet, Mr. Pritchard, I would be pleased to accept. There is no dramatic embrace, no breathless exclamations, only a serene acknowledgement that an understanding has been reached. But the process is far from complete. Following Eleanor's acceptance, the families must convene to formalize the engagement. Letters are dispatched to relatives. Announcements are drafted with the appropriate blend of pride and restraint. The engagement is not simply a private agreement, it is a public contract, a merging of two family names, and as such, it demands documentation. Engagements are often published in society pages. Their phrasing carefully curated. A marriage is arranged between Mr. Jonathan Pritchard, only son of Mr. and Mrs. Edwin Pritchard of Harrogate, and Miss Eleanor Fairchild, eldest daughter of Mr. and Mrs. Reginald Fairchild of Grosvenor Square. Alongside these formalities, the families engage in discussions regarding settlements and dowries. Negotiations handled with the same tone one might reserve for property transactions. A marriage, after all, was as much an alliance of fortunes as it was a union of hearts. Legal documents are drawn up, trustees are appointed, and the quiet rustle of parchment becomes the soundtrack of a proposal finalized not with impassioned speeches, but with signatures and wax seals. Eleanor, now officially a fiancée, is presented with a ring, not a surprise gift, but an expected token. Its design often chosen in consultation with mothers or a trusted jeweler. The ring is admired, commented upon during social visits, and serves as a visual confirmation that the engagement is proceeding along its proper course. From this point forward, Eleanor and Jonathan are allowed a modicum of increased familiarity. They may sit beside each other during family gatherings, perhaps even exchange soft-spoken words on a garden bench, though always within a chaperoned context. The engagement has altered their status, but not the rules that govern their interactions. In many ways, the proposal is less a singular dramatic moment and more a prolonged series of quiet affirmations, each step suffused with ceremony and subtlety. The Victorian engagement is not about passion boldly declared. It is about patience, propriety, and the careful alignment of social expectations. The proposal, far from being an endpoint, is merely another stage in a courtship defined by its adherence to decorum. As the days unfold, plans for the wedding will slowly take shape, not through hurried elopements or clandestine whispers, but through a steady procession of lists, invitations, fittings, and consultations. The engagement, with all its paperwork and permissions, will evolve seamlessly into the next chapter of etiquette-bound rituals. A transition as smooth and unhurried as the flick of a lace fan in a crowded drawing room. And so, Mr. Pritchard's proposal is completed not with fireworks or grand declarations, but with the soft, deliberate rustle of formal documents and the measured, approving nods of family elders. Love, in the Victorian sense, is not rushed. It is processed, documented, announced, and agreed upon a quiet, methodical affair that values endurance and patience above all else. In the labyrinth of Victorian courtship, the greatest threat was not heartbreak or rejection, but scandal. A misstep, so minor it would be invisible in any other era. Misplaced glove, an unchaperoned conversation, a glance that lingered a breath too long could unravel reputations with the soft, insidious speed of whispered gossip. The rules were suffocating in their strictness, yet so fragile that a single breach could render months of careful courtship meaningless. It was a world where impropriety lurked in the tiniest of gestures and the consequences of carelessness. Whereas swift as they were quiet, picture a serene garden party, the afternoon air gently perfumed with the scent of lilacs in the distant hum of bees weaving through neatly trimmed hedgerows, ladies in pastel muslin gowns, their parasols casting delicate patches of shade, promenade slowly along the gravel paths. Gentlemen in perfectly tailored frock coats converse in subdued tones, always mindful of posture, of the precise distance maintained between themselves and their female counterparts. In this world of quiet civility, the rules are invisible, yet omnipresent, a silent scaffolding upon which every interaction is carefully balanced. It is within such a setting that a minor, almost imperceptible scandal might unfold. Perhaps Eleanor Fairchild, now engaged to Mr. Jonathan Pritchard, has set aside her gloves upon the stone bench while adjusting the ribbon of her bonnet. Jonathan, ever the attentive suitor, notices the glove's soft kid leather, delicately embroidered. At the wrist and, with a well-intentioned gesture, picks them up to return them to her. He holds them for no more than a moment, perhaps murmuring a polite observation about the fine weather or her choice of flowers. And yet, that single act, his hand holding her glove, has already crossed an invisible threshold. To be untrained. It is an innocuous moment. But to Mrs. Fairchild, watching discreetly from a shaded pavilion, and to the ever-watchful eyes of society, it is a breach of decorum. A gentleman should not touch a lady's personal items, particularly not in public view. A glove is not merely an accessory. It is an extension of a lady's private sphere. To handle it without the protective layer of social distance is to hint, however subtly, at an intimacy that propriety forbids. And so, within moments, the whispers begin, the soft rustle of parasols turning slightly toward the scene, the faintest arch of a matron's eyebrow, the near-silent exchange of glances between two chaperones. No words need to be spoken aloud. For the judgment to take root, the danger of impropriety in Victorian courtship was not in the obvious transgressions, but in the way society thrived on implication. A young lady did not need to be caught alone with a gentleman to be suspected of forwardness. A misplaced glove or an unsanctioned walk in the wrong part of a garden was enough to cast a shadow. Gossip, in this world, moved not with the roar of scandalous headlines, but with the quiet persistence of water seeping through stone. What began as a casual observation over tea could, by the following week, be transformed into a whispered question. "Did you hear that Mr. Pritchard was seen?" Holding Miss Fairchild's glove. Such familiarity, so early in an engagement. For Eleanor and Jonathan, the consequences might be as subtle as a change in tone. Invitations that once arrived promptly might now be delayed. Conversations at gatherings might be shorter, more perfunctory. Mrs. Fairchild, in response, would increase the visibility of her chaperoning, ensuring that Eleanor is never seen without maternal oversight. Jonathan, too, might find his usual visits shortened or rearranged under the guise of scheduling conflicts. All of this would unfold quietly, without accusation or confrontation. In Victorian society, scandal was not a firestorm. It was a slow suffocation. The strictness of these unspoken rules made Victorian courtship an endurance of perpetual self-awareness. A couple's every move was subject to interpretation, every interaction a potential misstep. Even a glance across a crowded room carried the weight of propriety held too long. It could be seen as bold, too fleeting as disinterest. This delicate balancing act required not only personal restraint, but a constant vigilance against the perceptions of others. For young women, the stakes were especially high. A single whisper of impropriety could tarnish a lady's reputation in ways that were difficult, if not impossible, to mend. An engagement could be reconsidered. Marriage prospects could quietly vanish. For men, the consequences were often less severe, yet even they were not immune to the silent consequences of society's judgment. A gentleman who displayed too much familiarity before an engagement was finalized might be deemed presumptuous, or worse, lacking in proper breeding. Thus, the minor scandal of a glove becomes a symbol of the suffocating tension underlying Victorian courtship. It is not the object itself that matters, but the breach it represents in the invisible contract of decorum. A simple, well-meaning gesture is enough to disturb the delicate surface of social expectations, sending ripples outward in a pattern of murmured disapproval. And yet, there is a quiet resilience within this world of rules and whispered judgments. Eleanor and Jonathan, though constrained by these rituals, learn to navigate the currents of propriety with subtle grace. They adapt, finding ways to express affection within the boundaries allowed a lingering glance, a carefully worded compliment, a shared smile that, though brief, conveys more than an entire part of the conversation. Their courtship becomes a delicate dance of patience, a test not of bold declarations, but of quiet endurance. In the end, the dangers of impropriety are not about gloves or glances. They are about the relentless vigilance required to exist within a society that measures virtue by the precision of etiquette. To love within such confines is to cultivate a kind of quiet strength, a patience that endures beyond the suffocating rules, waiting for the day when such gestures no longer require the approval of a watchful world. The word engaged might suggest a sense of active progress, a forward motion toward marriage, but in Victorian England, engagement often signified the beginning of an altogether different kind of journey, one characterized not by excitement, but by waiting, endless, polite, suffocating waiting. It was a pause button pressed firmly upon a couple's lives, holding them in a state of suspended anticipation, where time seemed to stretch and meander like the soft ticking of a grandfather clock in a quiet drawing room. Eleanor Fairchild, now officially engaged to Mr. Jonathan Pritchard, might have imagined that the formal announcement of their betrothal would mark a turning point, a loosening of social restraints, perhaps, or at least, a sense of approaching resolution. Yet the Victorian engagement was not so much a bridge to marriage, as it was a prolonged test of endurance. The length of an engagement was determined by a complicated web of factors, the readiness of financial arrangements, the convenience of family schedules, the slow wheels of property settlements, and in many cases, an almost arbitrary adherence to tradition. It was not unusual for engagements to linger for a year or two or even longer, with the couple left to wait patiently. In the wings, while the machinery of society slowly ground forward, the days during this waiting period unfolded with a peculiar, deliberate slowness. Visits continued, of course, but always under the same suffocating decorum as before. Jonathan might be invited to tea at the Fairchild residence, where he would sit in the same high-backed chair, holding the same delicate china cup, engaging in the same carefully navigated conversations. now with the added formality of his new title, Eleanor's intended. There was a slight shift in the tone of these interactions. A faint acknowledgement that the couple's relationship had progressed, yet no actual freedoms were granted. They remained firmly under the chaperone's watchful gaze, their proximity carefully monitored. Their conversations still veiled in polite restraint. Letters continued as well, meticulously penned, scrutinized for decorum, and sent through the slow, winding paths of the postal service. Each letter was a quiet exercise. In patience, Jonathan might write a page or two expressing his admiration for Eleanor's latest piano, recital, or remarking upon the recent improvements in his family's garden. Eleanor, in return, would compose a similarly measured reply, perhaps reflecting on the fine weather or the newest embroidery pattern she was working on. Beneath these polite exchanges, a muted longing existed, a quiet frustration that words must be so carefully chosen, so rigorously filtered through the lens of social. Expectations. The engagement period was not merely a test of patience for the couple, but also a time of quiet endurance for their families. Mothers busied themselves with preparations that seemed to move in slow, ceremonial steps, ordering fabric samples for wedding gowns, consulting with caterers, drawing up endless guest lists that were revised and re-revised over afternoon. Teas. Fathers discussed settlements and dowries in hushed tones, their conversations resembling business negotiations more than familial celebrations. Every decision, from the shade of the bridesmaids' ribbons to the design of the wedding invitations, seemed to require an inordinate amount of time, as though the very slowness of the process was a mark of propriety. Eleanor, though surrounded by the trappings of wedding preparations, might feel an odd sense of distance from the event itself. The reality of marriage, of being alone with Jonathan, free from the stiff supervision of parlors and promenades, remained an abstract, far-off idea, obscured by layers of etiquette and endless waiting. The days became a repetitive cycle, mornings spent in sewing circles, afternoons filled with polite visits to other engaged young ladies, similarly trapped in the limbo of prolonged betrothal. Evenings marked by family dinners where conversation, topics tiptoed delicately around anything remotely personal. Even the simple pleasure of walking together remained bound by rigid decorum. Chaperone strolls through Hyde Park or the carefully manicured gardens of a country estate offered brief moments of shared space, yet the presence of a watchful mother or aunt ensured that no conversation veered into territory too intimate. Every glance, every gesture remained calculated. The couple could be together in a physical sense, yet their interactions were still hemmed in by the invisible fence of Victorian propriety. For Jonathan, the waiting brought its own quiet frustrations. He might spend his days managing family business affairs, attending to estate matters, or writing letters of polite inquiry to wedding suppliers, all the while feeling a subtle but persistent ache, a longing not only for Eleanor's company, but for the simple freedom to share a conversation unfiltered by social performance. His affections, though genuine, were required to simmer gently beneath a surface of polite restraint, never allowed to boil over into anything resembling spontaneous emotion. And yet, within this long, meandering engagement period, there existed a peculiar kind of bonding. The very slowness of it all, the endless letters, the rehearsed conversations, the shared endurance of society's expectations became, in its own way, a quiet foundation upon which relationships were built. Eleanor and Jonathan learned to read between the lines of each other's letters, to find meaning in subtle gestures, to cultivate a patience that modern romances, with their breathless speed, often lack. Their connection, though shaped and stifled by the rigid architecture of Victorian courtship, was made resilient through the simple act of enduring the wait together. As months drifted into years, the engagement became a ritual of waiting, not for its own sake, but as a proving ground of sorts, a quiet test of compatibility conducted beneath the polite veneer of social etiquette. There was no dramatic urgency, no elopement schemes, no hurried wedding bells, only the slow, measured unfolding of time, marked by the steady tick-tock of mantel clocks, the rustle of lace being arranged, the soft scratch of quills on parchment. Love in this world was less a tempest and more a slow river, winding gently through a landscape of unspoken expectations and suffocating decorum. And so Eleanor and Jonathan waited. They waited as wedding plans were made, unmade, and remade. They waited as family negotiations unfolded in drawn-out meetings over sherry and cigar smoke. They waited through tea parties, garden walks, and endless formal dinners. And through it all, their courtship, wrapped tightly in the endless folds of Victorian propriety, became a quiet endurance, a love story not of grand passions, but of patience, persistence, and the slow, suffocating grace of waiting in the soft-lit parlors of Victorian England, where every glance was measured and every conversation rehearsed. The notion of romantic love was often eclipsed by a far more pressing concern, the arrangement. Marriage, for many, was not the culmination of a passionate love affair, but rather the quiet closing of a well-negotiated contract. It was a business transaction conducted beneath layers of lace and politeness, where wealth, social status, and family alliances held far more weight than the tender flutterings of the heart. Love, if it came at all, was expected to follow, a gentle secondary reward for a union that served its true purpose in the structured machinery of society. Imagine a drawing room filled with the quiet rustle of silk skirts as mothers perched on upholstered chairs, their gloved hands resting lightly on the polished arms, exchanging carefully veiled inquiries about dowries and inheritances. Fathers, in their somber waistcoats, would speak in low, clipped tones, discussing estates, investments, and the lineage of potential matches as though they were assessing livestock. The young couple at the center of this quiet negotiation. Perhaps Eleanor Fairchild and Jonathan Pritchard might sit in polite stillness, sipping tea, while their futures were delicately bartered over their heads. Their thoughts might flutter toward each other in quiet moments. But in the grand calculus of marriage arrangements, their personal inclinations were but one small variable in a much larger equation. The idea of marrying purely for affection was viewed with a certain suspicion, even a touch of frivolity. A love match, while romantic in novels, was often considered imprudent in real life. Marriage was not merely a private union. It was a social alliance, a strategic merger of families, fortunes, and reputations. A well-arranged marriage could secure an advantageous dowry, elevate a family's standing, or consolidate land holdings. Conversely, a poorly considered match could dilute a family's influence, create financial strain, or invite unwanted gossip. Thus, the stakes were high, and emotions were expected to wait their turn. The process of arranging a marriage was not a hurried affair. It unfolded in slow, deliberate steps, often beginning with a subtle inquiry, a casual mention of a young lady's recent accomplishments at a society event, a passing remark on a gentleman's prospects in Parliament. From there, interest would be gauged through intermediaries, a family friend, a well-placed aunt, or perhaps the ever-present chaperone who had been quietly noting the interactions at various balls and teas. If the initial signals were favorable, the process would proceed to more formal discussions, always framed in the language of propriety, but with an unmistakable undercurrent of negotiation. Eleanor's dowry, for instance, would be a subject of careful calculation. It was not simply a monetary figure, but a reflection of her family's wealth, social standing, and, in a quiet, unspoken way, her own worth in the marriage market. Jonathan's prospects would be scrutinized in return. His inheritance, his future income, his family's connections. These discussions, while couched in polite euphemisms, were no less businesslike than any commercial contract. Love, if it was mentioned at all, was expected to blossom quietly after the ink had dried on settlement papers. This did not mean that affection was entirely absent from such arrangements. Many Victorian couples grew fond of each other over time, finding companionship in the shared rituals of their carefully structured lives. However, the path to marriage was rarely paved by romantic impulse. The excitement of secret letters and stolen glances existed. but always beneath the overarching framework of social strategy. Even the most tender courtships were often choreographed to align with the family's broader ambitions. Once the terms of a marriage were agreed upon, the engagement would be publicly announced, followed by a period of continued observation. The couple's interactions were still monitored, ensuring that their behavior remained within the bounds of propriety. The formalities of engagement were, in essence, a final phase of the arrangement, a public affirmation that both families reached a satisfactory accord and that the match would proceed without scandal or impropriety in this world. The signing of marriage contracts was as ceremonious as any wedding vow. The soft scratch of quills signing documents, the precise fold of legal papers sealed with wax, the quiet murmurs of approval from fathers and uncles. These were the true markers of a Victorian engagement's success. The actual wedding, with its flowers and lace, was merely the outward display of an agreement already long settled. Eleanor and Jonathan, though undoubtedly aware of the transactional nature of their courtship, might find small rebellions within the arrangement. A shared smile over tea, a fleeting moment of unsupervised conversation during a family dinner. These were the quiet spaces where affection could begin to grow. Yet even these moments existed within the larger, unyielding structure of expectation. Love was not the spark that ignited a Victorian marriage. It was the embers that, if tended carefully, might someday burn quietly beneath the surface to modern eyes. This approach to marriage may seem cold, calculated, even unromantic. But within the Victorian framework, it was seen as a stabilizing force. Passion, with all its unpredictability, was considered a poor foundation for a lifelong union. A marriage built on compatible fortunes, shared social standing, and mutual familial respect was deemed far more enduring. Love in this context was not a prerequisite for marriage. It was, at best, a hopeful afterthought, and so Victorian couples like Eleanor and Jonathan entered into their arrangements with a kind of resigned patience. They understood the roles they were expected to play, the quiet negotiations that would shape their futures. There was no dramatic elopement, no breathless declarations beneath moonlit balconies. Instead, there was the slow, deliberate choreography of families aligning, their interests ensuring that every step toward the altar was made with careful consideration. Theirs was a love story measured in quiet agreements and polite nods, where affection, if it was to come, would arrive not with fireworks, but with the soft, steady rhythm of two lives arranged to move in tandem. If there was any refuge from the suffocating rituals of Victorian courtship, it might be found just barely in the countryside, away from the crowded ballrooms of London, the endless parlor visits and the relentless gossip of town life. The rural estates and sprawling gardens of the English countryside offered a setting that, while still steeped in decorum, allowed for a breath or two of fresh, unsupervised air. But make no mistake, even amidst the hedgerows and meadows, courtship remained an intricate dance of propriety. The countryside, for all its charm, simply wrapped its same rigid rules in softer, pastoral scenery. Picture, if you will, Eleanor, Fairchild once again, her parasol delicately balanced upon her shoulder, walking along a gravel path that wound through the gardens of a family estate. Jonathan Pritchard, as ever, maintained a careful 2 paces beside her, his gloved hands clasped politely behind his back. Somewhere not far behind them, Eleanor's aunt, a formidable figure armed with a lace-trimmed bonnet and a watchful eye, followed at a respectful, yet not too distant, space. The stroll might have appeared to offer privacy, but in truth, every word spoken, every glance exchanged was still carefully observed, every action weighed against the expectations of genteel behavior. Yet, despite the persistent presence of chaperones, the countryside stroll allowed for a small illusion of intimacy. The open air, the rustle of leaves stirred by a gentle breeze, the occasional distraction of a bird taking flight, these simple, natural intrusions softened the edges of conversation, unlike the stifling stillness of a drawing room, where every silence hung heavy and every word echoed too sharply. The outdoors provided a forgiving backdrop. Eleanor and Jonathan could speak about the weather, the changing seasons, the progress of the estate's rose garden, mundane topics, yet ones that allowed them to share a moment of dialogue free from the rigid formalities of a parlor visit. Picnics, too, became a favored countryside pastime, though even these were orchestrated with military precision. Families would arrange elaborate outings beneath great oak trees or by the banks of a quiet stream. Baskets filled with neatly cut sandwiches. Scones and perfectly folded linen napkins would be unpacked with ceremonial care. Young men were expected to demonstrate their suitability, not through grand romantic gestures, but through practical skills, opening parasols, fetching water, or perhaps assisting with the arrangement of a picnic blanket, all under the approving gaze of their elders. Every interaction remained carefully within bounds. Yet there was a subtle loosening of stiffness when one sat upon the grass rather than in a high-backed chair dot in these rural settings. There was also a greater allowance for shared activities, carefully selected, of course, to maintain decorum. A gentleman might offer to teach a young lady how to fly a kite or join her in observing the progress of the estate's beehives. The act of doing, however small and restrained, allowed for moments of unspoken connection. The shared silence, while watching clouds drift lazily across a blue sky, felt somehow less oppressive than the silence of a parlor. And though conversations remained light and proper, there was a softening of edges, a faint suggestion of companionship beneath the layers of etiquette. Countryside visits also brought with them the extended presence of distant relatives, many of whom saw themselves as the rightful arbiters of a young couple's compatibility. These well-meaning, if meddlesome, aunts and cousins would often orchestrate impromptu croquet matches or organize small walking parties through the estate grounds. Under the guise of leisure, these activities served as subtle evaluations, opportunities for family members to observe how a prospective couple navigated small challenges together. Was the gentleman patient when his partner's croquet shot went awry? Did the young lady display the right blend of modesty and engagement during a group stroll? These small moments, though seemingly insignificant, were quietly noted and added to the ongoing assessment of the match's suitability. Yet, even amidst the slight easing of town life's rigid choreography, the essence of Victorian courtship remained firmly intact. A misplaced gesture, an overly familiar remark, or an unchaperoned detour down a shaded garden path could still spark the embers of scandal. The countryside might offer longer walks and softer silences, but it was not a place of reckless abandon. Reputation remained a fragile, precious thing, and even the most innocent countryside outing was framed by an unspoken awareness of the ever-watchful social eye for Eleanor and Jonathan. These rural interludes became a kind of gentle reprieve, a space where they could practice the art of being together, even if only in the quiet margins permitted by propriety. They learned to share thoughts, not through bold declarations, but through the small inflections of their voices, the careful choice of a word, the lingering pause before responding. It was a courtship conducted in soft footfalls upon dewy grass, in the shared glance at a distant meadow, in the polite exchange of remarks about the blossoming lilac's dot in many ways. The countryside courtship mirrored the landscape itself, tranquil, methodical, and utterly unhurried. It lacked the intensity of clandestine romances or the flair of grand gestures. But within its quiet, meandering pace, it offered a slow cultivation of companionship. The very boredom of it, the long, uneventful afternoons, the predictable circuits of garden paths became, paradoxically, a setting in which two people might come to know one another not through dramatic passion, but through the simple endurance of time shared under the same ever-watchful sky. Thus, the countryside, though slightly less awful in its allowance of movement and space, remained firmly entrenched in the tedious rituals of Victorian courtship. It was not a sanctuary of freedom, but a softer stage upon which the same rigid play unfolded, just with a bit more greenery, and a slightly gentler breeze dot at last, after the long, delicate waltz of glances, calling cards, supervised strolls. and endless family negotiations. A Victorian courtship would culminate in what many believe to be the ultimate moment of romance, the wedding. But for those within the folds of Victorian society, the wedding was not the triumphant conclusion of love's journey. Rather, it was a grand display of yet more etiquette, an elaborate ceremonial shift from one set of suffocating rules to another, equally rigid and exhausting. For the newlyweds, the wedding day marked not a liberation into marital bliss, but the beginning of a lifetime of social expectations, obligations, and rituals that stretched far beyond the altar. The preparations for a Victorian wedding were themselves a quiet endurance test. Months before a single flower was arranged, families would gather in drawing rooms to pore over guest lists, ensuring that every invitation was extended or withheld with the utmost care. The rustle of heavy invitation cards being stacked in perfect alignment upon a side table, the faint scratching of fountain pens inscribing names with slow precision, these were the sounds that echoed through households as mothers orchestrated. The guest list like a complex chessboard. Every inclusion signaled alliance. Every omission, a deliberate social message. The bride, too, found herself enveloped in layers of ritual long before she reached the church doors. Choosing the wedding gown was less a matter of personal taste and more a reflection of family dignity. White, though now synonymous with weddings, was still a symbol of wealth and purity, its impracticality silently broadcasting the family's ability to afford a garment worn but once. Dress fittings became solemn affairs, with every hemline, lace overlay, and pearl button subject to collective scrutiny. A bride might long for a moment alone to admire her reflection, yet found herself surrounded by a chorus of aunts and seamstresses, offering opinions couched in the gentlest but firmest tones. On the wedding day itself, the air was thick not with the thrill of romance but with the heavy scent of formality. Picture Eleanor Fairchild, her silk train trailing several feet. Behind her, stepping with careful precision through the grand aisle of St. Mary's Church, the soft murmur of organ music rolled through the stone arches, mingling with the faint shuffle of feet as guests shifted on polished pews. Each step she took was accompanied by an unspoken checklist of expectations, to walk neither too quickly, nor too slowly, to smile softly yet remain composed, to glance demurely at Jonathan, standing at the altar, but not to linger too long. Jonathan himself stood poised in his morning coat, the crispness of his cravat carefully arranged by his valet. Earlier that morning, his role was to appear steady, dignified, and thoroughly unemotional. No dramatic declarations, no impassioned embraces. The Victorian groom was expected to be the epitome of composed respectability. As he awaited his bride, his thoughts might well have wandered not toward the romance of the moment, but toward the logistics of the wedding breakfast, or the upcoming handshakes with distant cousins whose name he barely remembered. The ceremony proceeded with quiet inevitability. Vows were exchanged in soft, rehearsed voices, each phrase carefully enunciated, devoid of personal embellishment. Rings were slipped onto gloved fingers with practiced ease, a symbol less of personal promise and more of social confirmation. The kiss, if allowed at all, was a brief, delicate brush, a nod to tradition rather than a moment of true intimacy. The congregation, seated in neat rows, offered polite, measured smiles, their thoughts perhaps already turning to the logistics of the upcoming reception, the wedding breakfast. The grand meal that followed was not a place for revelry, but rather another stage upon which the art of propriety continued. Long tables adorned with immaculate linen, delicate porcelain, and arrangements of lily and roses became arenas of controlled conversation. Eleanor and Jonathan, seated at the center, played host under the unrelenting gaze of family elders and society matrons. Every interaction, a nod, a toast, a passing of the breadbasket, became a performance in genteel decorum. Laughter, if it arose, was kept at a gentle murmur. No dramatic speeches, no raucous merriment, just the slow, rhythmic clinking of silverware and the low hum of approved topics. Even the cutting of the wedding cake, now a joyous moment and modern, ceremonies was laden with symbolism. The knife, often a family heirloom, would be guided by the hands of both bride and groom, their smiles perfectly poised for the artist stationed discreetly to capture the moment in delicate sketch. The cake itself, a heavy, elaborately iced structure, was less a dessert and more a statement of familial prestige, its layers representing the solidity and weight of the union it celebrated. Once the guests had departed and the final carriage had rattled away, the newlyweds might have shared a fleeting moment of genuine privacy. Yet, even in this, the expectations of propriety loomed large. Their departure for the honeymoon, often a carefully selected estate or a tour of the Lake District, was observed by family and staff with a sense of ceremonial gravity. The luggage was arranged with military precision, and even the act of stepping into the carriage became a choreographed gesture of married dignity. What Eleanor and Jonathan might have realized, as the countryside blurred past their carriage windows, was that their wedding had not marked an escape from the labyrinth of social codes. Instead, it had simply ushered them into a new chapter of etiquette. The roles of husband and wife came, with their own scripts to follow, hosting dinner parties with the correct guest lists, attending charity functions, maintaining appearances during Sunday services. The rituals continued, shifting only in their details, but never in their relentless demand for conformity. And so the Victorian wedding, far from being a romantic crescendo, was a quiet handover, a transfer of social responsibilities from courtship to marriage, wrapped in silk, lace, and the soft murmur of organ music. For Eleanor and Jonathan, love, if it was to be found, would not be forged in the grand spectacle of their wedding day, but in the quiet spaces between duties, in shared glances across a crowded drawing room, or in the subdued warmth of a conversation. At the end of a long, polite evening, the wedding had solved nothing. It had merely moved them from one set of social expectations to another. The dance of decorum would continue, step by measured step, long after the last guest had left and the final flower arrangement had wilted.